Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming this afternoon to the Baker Institute. Since its inception a little less than 4 years ago, the Institute, through its programmatic activity, has focused on the historic and future importance of United States-Russian relations. In our inaugural conference in 1995, the former Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union, Alexander Besmertnik, was a major participant in our deliberations. And in 1996, the Baker Institute and the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton co-sponsored a unique colloquium on Cold War Endgame, which brought together top United States foreign policy makers, including former Secretary of State James Baker and National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, together with their then Soviet counterparts, to discuss how both sides managed the tumultuous diplomacy of the Cold War's end. In the Institute's energy studies on the Persian Gulf and the Caspian Sea basin, we have included Russian participants to obtain Russian views on energy supply and security issues. And at our conference last October, our annual conference featuring former Secretaries of State Kissinger, Baker, and Christopher, and former Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev, there was an important difference of views on the issue of NATO expansion between the U.S. side and Gorbachev. Recently, in my visit to Moscow last November with the Harvard JFK School, our high-level Russian interlocutors conveyed their concern over U.S. policy toward Russia and posed the question of whether or not the United States' strategic objective toward Russia in the post-Cold War era is to relegate Russia to a secondary status, and whether or not we're pinning our bets on China more than Russia. And then, just last week, General Lebed, in his presentation, gave us a much more relaxed view of the state of U.S.-Russian relations, but of course, those of you who were there, he made a very bitter and strong criticism of the internal political situation in Russia. Today, we are truly fortunate to obtain the views of one of our country's most informed scholars on Russia. The Honorable James H. Billington, the Librarian of Congress, will speak to us on the nature of the Russian transformation, and he has agreed to take questions after his presentation for us to have an exchange. You have in your programs a resume of Dr. Billington's very impressive credentials. Let me go over some of his biography. He was sworn in as the Librarian of Congress on September 14, 1987. He is the 13th incumbent of that position since the library was established in 1800. An author and historian, as well as educator and administrator, Dr. Billington came to the library from the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he had served as director since 1973. He received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University, graduating as valedictorian of the class of 1950. It's very interesting because Dr. Billington just told me that he's somewhere in between George Shultz and James Baker as a graduate in that period from Princeton. 3 years later, he earned his doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar at Balliol College. Following service with the U.S. Army, he became a history instructor at Harvard University in 1957 and an assistant professor of history and research fellow at the Russian Research Center next year. He moved to the faculty of Princeton University in 1962 and was professor of history at Princeton from 1964 to 1974. From 1973 to 1987, Dr. Billington was the director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, which is the national memorial to the 28th President of the United States. And it's really impressive that under his directorship, 8 new programs were established at the center, beginning with the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies in 1974, which has become quite famous. 2 of the projects Dr. Billington initiated at the center were the Wilson Quarterly, founded in 1976, and the publication of detailed scholars' guides to educational resources in Washington. He has written extensively. He is the author of The Icon and the Axe, published in 1966, Fire in the Minds of Men, published in 1980, and most recently, Russia Transformed, Breakthrough to Hope in 1992. He has also participated as a host, a commentator, a consultant on numerous educational and network television programs, has accompanied congressional delegations, and also accompanied President Mrs. Reagan to the Soviet summit in Moscow in 1993. He has many other positions, a longtime member of the Editorial Advisory Board of Foreign Affairs, and a former member of the Editorial Advisory Board of Theology Today. He holds a number of honorary degrees. The Billingtons have 4 children, one of whom we are happy to have with us today, Ann Billington Fisher, his daughter, who lives here in Texas. So, Dr. Billington, without any further ado, we are honored to have you here, and we're looking forward to your remarks. Welcome, Dr. Billington.
Thank you very much for those kind, somewhat excessive words. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I feel particularly honored to be at the Baker Institute because while you all know of Secretary Baker's great exploits in probably the most distinguished set of appointments in the executive branch maybe anybody's had in recent years, all of them filled with great distinction. But on the side, he was a wonderful board member of the Wilson Center when I was directing it, and can be properly viewed as one of the builders of that institution, as well as, of course, the creator and the inspirer of this one. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and yeah, in honor of the occasion, not that it's I'm going to say anything very electrifying, but I am at least going to say some things that I've never said before in public, because I feel obliged to the presence of my old board member, and now we're colleagues on that board. I feel obliged to try to say something that's of some interest, and I might also put in a word of appreciation for Susan Baker, who I was recently there with a group of congressmen discussing the question of this new law on religion, which they've put up, and they said, we asked a bunch of Russians, said, well, what other Americans would you like to talk to? And they said, Susan Baker. So you had a real team there, and it's a great honor to be here, and I know that my daughter feels the same way about Susan Baker as an important part of that rather unique team. It's so let me launch into something. Let me begin by saying that the nature of the Russian transformation, the fundamental point that I want to make is that it is not an economic crisis fundamentally, it is not a political crisis fundamentally even, though that's all that we talk about, particularly in a week when Yeltsin has fired his whole cabinet and thinking about which ones he's going to pull back. And it's fundamentally an interregnum, it's fundamentally a crisis of legitimacy. And there are only 2 major possible outcomes of that crisis of legitimacy, and this country has an enormous stake in which outcome occurs. That's what I want to talk about, and I want to end up with a kind of unusual policy recommendation, because I think there isn't enough serious talk about these problems and these possibilities. And a great scholarly institution like this one is a good place to throw out ideas, because I think they need a lot more examination than probably we can give them in the hurly-burly of Washington. Now, I pick up on something Ed said at the beginning about what your apparent experience was with the Russians on this thing about saying, is America really interested in Russia anymore, and so forth. Nothing produces deeper hostility in human relationships than the feeling that you are simultaneously being humiliated and ignored by somebody that you feel very close to. Crimes of passion between individuals classically arise out of unrequited love. Ineradicable divisions classically open up when a group defines itself by simultaneously both insulting another group and patronizing them then as if they were little children. No wars are more bitter than civil wars or family disputes, interfamily disputes. Now, nothing would probably surprise most Americans more than the 5 propositions I want to put before you today. because I don't think any of them are part of the conventional wisdom at the moment. First, America is now, much more than we realize, the model that most Russians seek to emulate. Two, America is widely, at this time, perceived in Russia today as having arrogated to itself essentially the master relationship in an essentially master-slave dialogue. Three, the compensating gestures that we periodically and quite sincerely make at various levels to reassure them of our friendship serve largely to deepen their overall sense of being humiliated and patronized. Now, it might not be important to linger over these somewhat disturbing and perhaps contradictory facts if it were not for the two other factors about Russia that are also not currently on the American radar screen. This is point 4. There is a real risk, I think, that Russia could produce in the next couple of years an authoritarian regime with many fascistic features that could in turn reproduce in other significant parts of the former Soviet Union the kind of explosive violence we have seen in recent years in Yugoslavia. In other words, there is a real risk, not of a reversion to communism, but of a giant Yugoslavia opening up in the heart of Eurasia with enormous geopolitical consequences. And fifth, and this may seem a contradiction, there is at the same time an absolutely extraordinary and unprecedented opportunity in the same period that Russia could become a major ally, significant trading partner with America in a far more intimate and mutually profitable way than anyone currently seems to think is possible. Now, these propositions, of course, are not part of what passes for conventional wisdom in America today, which is that more or less Russia is likely to bumble on without being either a real menace or a real partner. Russia is seen as basically a third world economy that will take many decades to be stable enough for long-term investment. Sorry, but I'm going to have to, in order to hold to a time limit, I'm going to read a text here, and this is just, if I may make a suggestion for the Baker Institute, is that you have a podium.
Instant solution. We have an instant
Thank
solution. I didn't know how tall you were.
Well, I didn't know how my eyes would fade.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's also close enough, so no disrespect. Anyhow, Russia is seen as basically a third world economy that will take many decades to be stable enough for long-term investment, and that our only real concern in Russia today is to prevent their export of dangerous weapons to other unfriendly states. And the only real story there is who is doing what to whom in the Kremlin this week. Now, rarely stated, but underlying this conventional wisdom, is the consensus among major geopolitical thinkers, at least the most prominent American ones, that Russia is inherently an authoritarian country anyhow, because of something that happened earlier under either the Mongols or Ivan the Terrible, or perhaps some unfortunate distribution of genetic properties. The most sophisticated new attempt at a post-Cold War geopolitical worldview, Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, consigns Russia's Orthodox Christian civilization to be inherently predisposed to hostility with European civilization, as is the Muslim world, the Confucian-based world of East Asia, and so forth. Those of us who argue that Russia is essentially a rather exotic but nevertheless unquestioned part of the European world, and that Russia contains considerable positive potential for good, are generally either ignored or dismissed as Russophiles. The fact that none of the 5 propositions I've outlined above is part of the conventional wisdom in America today should, I would suggest at the beginning, rather perversely, make them at least worthy of consideration, precisely because the conventional wisdom of the West about Russia has been so consistently wrong throughout the 20th century. The controlling elements of the thinking class in the West, it is often forgotten, basically believed that Russia was a progressive under Stalin, that the Soviet system would more or less last forever under his heirs, and that it is likely now to bumble along in the back burner of geopolitics and not merit much attention. It is precisely geopolitics, however, that should make it imperative that Russia be taken more seriously today. America has fought 5 wars in the 20th century, all essentially for one purpose: to prevent authoritarian power from consolidating too much dominion and authority over the Eurasian heartland, the dominant landmass of the planet, and marginalizing the free and entrepreneurial societies of America and the maritime periphery of the Eurasian landmass. If a centralized authoritarian state were to replace Russia's present fumbling experiment at democracy and a market economy, democratic politics and market-oriented economics throughout the world will suffer more than anyone currently thinks possible. The first likely result of an authoritarian nationalist regime in Russia would be the immediate radicalization of some, if not most, of the new, presently moderate Islamic states that have been carved out of the southern part of what used to be the USSR. This would in turn radically destabilize the balance of power in the Middle East and create a far larger cohort of hostile states there, just to take one scenario. Meanwhile, the unchecked growth of power, self-confidence of the Chinese will almost certainly lead to their increased involvement in Siberia, where they already currently have more than 2.5 million guest workers in a region the size of the United States, which has a population of only 12 million Russians. Now, the probability that the authority of either radical Islam or communist China will grow at the expense of Russia and Eurasia should put the strengthening of a democratic Russia on the front burner of Western policy. Whether authoritarian Russia would end up in conflict with or basically subordinated to such authoritarian political alternatives is not, from the point of view of American interests, either outcome would be almost equally bad. But there is a positive reason for giving higher priority to Russia in our foreign policy. The great interior heartland of Russia still controls by far the largest and most varied supply of the world's unused natural resources. I would say, based on a rather extensive trip I took with the Senate committee a couple of years ago, and I think it was a general conclusion of those on it, that this supply is even greater than the most liberal estimates of how great the natural gas, the oil, the gold, the diamonds, you name it, almost anything of any significance that has remained in the earth and yet to be unearthed and brought into productive use. It is quite incomprehensible that the raw geopolitical importance of the world's last frontier in interior Russia is not taken more seriously by either the analysts of our economy or the prophets of our geopolitics, who seem more interested these days in dealing with genuinely authoritarian police states in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, often run by, rather largely run by the former secret police establishments. But let me turn to the propositions I set out at the beginning and ask the 2 tough questions that should be asked, particularly in a rigorous academic environment, about these kinds of propositions. What is the main argument against each of these propositions I have set forth? And what, if anything, can we from the outside do about it anyhow? First, the main argument against the fact that the assertion that we are the main model for them is the legitimate argument that our histories are so totally different that they can't possibly think of themselves as becoming another United States. And this seems quite plausible, except Russian culture, the way that Russian has developed in periods of radical transformation, you have a constant sort of lethargic constant in Russia, but the price that a society like that pays is that the deferred maintenance builds up, and then you get periods of sudden great change, like they're going through now, and it's rather chaotic. But in these periods of change throughout Russian history, they have always taken as their model their principal adversary. They raided Byzantium for 100 years before they suddenly adopted all of Byzantine culture. They fought the Swedes for 50 years before they suddenly adopted under Peter the Great an entirely Swedish system of government and administration. The French burned occupied and burned Moscow, and the aristocracy began speaking French. As they were getting ready to fight the Germans in 2 world wars, they adopted a basically German system of large-scale industrial organization. And for the last half century, we have been both the country that they're trying to overtake and surpass in the Soviet period and the country that they're trying to emulate. So this business of being their principal enemy also makes it a source of fascination. And now that we're no longer even the enemy, not only the source of fascination, but the actual institutional models have been very heavily tilted in our direction. So, and for better or worse, the television, the new mass media, the new freedom, the new glasnost, which was very real and was the major engine of change in this transformation, has brought in an enormous flood of Americana, which, although it's causing a lot of negative reaction, it nevertheless is the subject of fascination. It's sort of our game to lose. And as you will gather from what I'm saying, we are pretty largely losing it. Second, the argument against the suggestion that Russians have a negative image of America today, despite this fascination, this sense that it's still somehow the model. The argument against saying that they have a negative image is that this has not clearly shown up in the polling data or in the elite dialogue between Russian and American leaders, although apparently it did show up in your conversation, which speaks well for the seriousness of it. Now, the hard fact is that polling data does not reveal the interior feelings of Russians, who have a tendency to put up with humiliations for a long period of time and then to explode with resentment and hostility, which surprises even themselves. Americans simply have no idea of the extent to which Russians have suffered and been humiliated by their own leaders, by a whole series of events. And people with deep impacted resentments have an explosive potential that's unlikely to be easily measured by superficial and overrated questionnaire techniques, which are in any event, Russians take joy in confusing, spiking, and in general making fun of, because they've been so deeply abused by this kind of technique throughout the entire Soviet period. The leadership groups that Americans have contact with often feel almost frighteningly dependent on outside reassurance, and they are the last people likely to bring up these kinds of problems. It's very characteristic that the 2 leaders in the last 10 years that the American establishment has felt most comfortable in dialoguing with in Russia, Gorbachev and Chernomyrdin, are people with about 1%, literally 1% acceptance rating internally among the Russian population. So the thought that we are communicating with the Russians by communicating with, now, it's not to say that they aren't admirable people in many respects and that they haven't played a very important role and that we shouldn't have been in dialogue with them. It is simply to suggest that the kinds of people who are oftentimes doing constructive things, and from our point of view, are not the best guides and informers of what is in fact going on in the civilization. We were tremendously surprised by the sudden appearance of Yeltsin and a whole series of other political events that have taken place. Far from proving that the Russian people no longer have deep resentment, the camaraderie and toasts offered by Russians seeking to gain short-term economic and political advantage from their American contacts are no more reliable indicators of long-term direction of mass politics in Russia than was the friendliness of the Shah to the American elite in the mid-1970s. 3, the main argument against the proposition that our compensating gestures of friendship are seen as patronizing is provided by the undoubted fact that individual Russians and small groups are usually very fond of and grateful for their American contacts, for the particular things that particular people are doing. But America as a nation, as an entity, as a source of fascination, which it basically is for Russians, is doing very little. Russians believe that in overthrowing communism themselves and repudiating in effect 80 years of their own history and of their own self-deception, they have accomplished something rather remarkable. They use the word podvig, or heroic deed, which is the term used both for military leaders and for saints in old Russia, to describe their something big. They have accepted as their model their erstwhile Cold War enemy, the United States. It is the only model, and it's a rational choice as well as an emotional one, because it's the only model of a continent-wide, multicultural federation under a democratic rule of law that seems analogous to them. And they like the sense of openness, the passion for a certain extroverted bigness, which they have generally admired in Americans, particularly, I might add, in Texans, and have generally found lacking among most Europeans. If they see themselves as having done something big, they see Americans as having done a lot of what they call malia diala, small deeds, little things, petty things. And that is in contrast with their image of what America is all about. Russians believe that people who talk big but do little are probably somehow conspiring eventually to do something profoundly hostile to them. In a large country without natural borders and with ethnic hostilities at almost every border region, this is seen as basically a desire to carve up Russia. And when a leading American geopolitician, one of our two leading most prominent geopoliticians, suddenly publicly are talking about further political subdivisions in a Russia that has already released 15 ethnic republics peacefully, Russians find new plausibility to the old propaganda line that certain circles, as they say, определенные круги, fixed circles, certain circles, we don't know who, not you, not me, not somebody, but certain circles somewhere, are secretly conspiring to destroy not just the Soviet Union as an ideological empire, but Russia as a nation altogether. So the little deeds that America has so far performed simply have not yet broken through or invalidated the classic image of a Western foreign foe using small gestures to mask a big hostility and a fundamental desire to destroy their very national existence. Now, there are two powerful arguments against assuming that there's any real danger of an authoritarian dictatorship in Russia. First argument is that a whole new political generation has arisen that is profoundly hostile to Russia's authoritarian tradition. The second argument is that Russians are fatigued with social violence in the name of some remote goals or revolutionary change that has plagued so much of their past. I've been filming a series for public television that will be broadcast in June, and I have an accompanying book called The Face of Russia. And one of my favorite images that illustrating this sense in which the revolutions, violent revolutions, I think of the past, is that storming the Winter Palace, the great mythic image of the revolution, is now a children's game. It's a sort of plastic, sort of trampoline sort of thing that you jump on. And so all over Russia, little kids are playing Storming the Winter Palace as a kind of game. It's a new consumer product that's selling very well. People jump up and down on this plastic wooden, this plastic semi-trampoline Winter Palace. And so that gives you an image of the new, there's a certain sense that the revolutions, the stormings, that's all a thing of the past. And that is all true. Those two arguments are valid. But the point is, the difficulty is that the very sense that something profoundly new is coming into being has produced a state of escalating panic among the large numbers of people who profited from the Soviet power structure and have felt disoriented ever since. And also among large numbers of ordinary people who are bitterly resentful at the conspicuous consumption, hedonism, and inequalities that have been produced by the early form that capitalism has taken in Russia, and the very peculiar form, where the demonstrable positive effects for the population as a whole are not nearly as evident as are the conspicuous consumption and the flood of short-term, it's basically exploitative trading relationships rather than long-term constructive investment relationships. Although there is no well-organized fascist movement in Russia, there are very important movements in this direction that have gotten almost no attention in the press coverage in this country. The de facto so-called Red-Brown Alliance, the old communists, and the new fascistic nationalists, and I use that word not in its just general sense. I mean, we have huge quantities of these publications piled up. We have an office in Moscow that collects this stuff. I can't get anybody to read it. You know, Washington's a city in which everyone talks and nobody reads. And this stuff is piling up. They produce this, well, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the alliance between the old communists and the new nationalists, the Red-Brown Alliance, dominates the Russian parliament, the lower house, certainly, and increasingly influences the entire rhetoric of mass politics. The momentum is all of the dialogue moves constantly in this direction, on both foreign policy and on domestic matters. In the absence of organized political parties to back up the reform impulses of the new Russian generation, the Communist Party remains the only nationally organized political party. The attempt to recreate Islam and the West as external enemies by the extreme nationalist Zhirinovsky did not entirely succeed, nor did the attempt to work out one's hostilities by crushing the Chechens. But that may not be the last form that interethnic violence will take on the territory of the former Soviet Union. Almost any further drift into authoritarian nationalism by Russia will likely lead to some of the kind of violence among groups with long historical resentments that we have seen in Yugoslavia. Again, it is a crisis of legitimacy between an authoritarian nationalist identity for Russia with a strong centralized and many fascistic tendencies, or a federated democratic open alternative for Russia. The stakes are very high, and at the moment, the momentum favors the authoritarian nationalist direction. The new law restricting religions with foreign connections in Russia is a particular irritant in this regard and represents a major victory for the red-brown anti-democratic coalition. The attempt to destroy the growing pluralism of religious belief by in effect reinstituting a reactionary version of Russian Orthodoxy as a virtual state religion, I might say a kind of orthodoxy without Christianity almost, because it's viewed, when the communists are advocating it, they're really talking about a form of social discipline rather than a form of moral renewal. It is both a concession of political weakness on the part of the democratic reformers who were unable to prevent it, and at the same time it's an enormous boon for the authoritarian nationalists because it provides a cloak of national legitimacy that they have never yet had. There was in fact an actual coup attempt within the church hierarchy that was organized by one of these small fascistic groups. And this is a story that has, again, not been told, but it's a very dramatic one. And of course, finally, the eastward expansion of NATO lends a new measure of credibility to the Russian nationalist argument that the West does indeed view Russia as a potential enemy rather than a potential partner. Now, finally, the last of these, my self-imposed cross-examination here, which I've no doubt stacked heavily in favor of all my conclusions. The major argument against seeing in Russia a land of vast opportunity arises precisely from an awareness of the political risks and dangers that I just alluded to. One could also argue against the assumption that democracy will ever work in Russia by reflecting on the outcome historically that there's been of previous times of troubles in Russian history. In the past, Russia has always tended, after a period of chaos and failed reform, to produce an authoritarianism that proved to be even worse than the one which led to the crisis in the first place. So there's every reason, it can be plausibly argued, to assume that there was some form of authoritarianism will be more menacing and unpleasant in the future than the more or less stable spectacle of communism in decline, but with relative stability as far as the outside world was concerned, as it existed under Gorbachev. However, just as Soviet totalitarianism was unlike any traditional monarchy or authoritarianism of the past, so Russia's present post-totalitarian situation differs profoundly from all past Russian times of troubles. First and foremost, there really is no external enemy. Everyone of consequence in the world, except for the more radical Middle Eastern regimes and the aging Chinese communist leadership, wishes the Russian experiment in democracy and market economy to succeed. Secondly, the younger generation has a totally different vision of themselves and their own country's nature and destiny than has ever been possible before, thanks to widespread education and, above all, to modern means of communication. Thirdly, the fundamental vehicle has been created for new democratic legitimacy, even if the political parties and institutions at the national level are not yet fully functioning. And finally, the fundamental economic base for long-range economic growth has also been created by a largely successful privatization of most of the economy except for agriculture and a few major monopolies, largely in the military-related industries, and to some extent in energy. Now, what is missing politically is the effective and accountable constitutional rule of law And what is missing economically is the major capital investment needed to make a free economy prosperous by jump-starting the development of Russia's enormous natural and indeed human resources. They have a higher technological literacy rate than the United States. It is precisely in these two areas that America, that's not to say they have, I'm talking about basic technological literacy in the population as a whole, not peak accomplishment, which is very badly weakened. But it is precisely in these two areas, namely that the development of a constitutional rule of law and the capital investment, that America has both the experience and the resources to be of enormous help to the Russians. And it is precisely because we are the model for the Russians in their current transformative stage of development that we face both the opportunity of a love affair and the dangers of unrequited love in our present irresolution as to whether or not we will do anything of any real significance with the Russians. By now, they have sustained their reform path more than a decade since it was launched under Gorbachev. But the unpleasant fact is that nothing America has yet done has signaled to the Russian people that we even notice them anymore. And for people who have endured as much humiliation, confusion, and decline in their overall standard of living as the Russians have, the likelihood of some irrational authoritarian turn is much greater than it might seem. The red-brown opposition realizes that time is not on their side, and that if there is not an authoritarian reversal soon, they will face provincial governors and other younger figures, like this new 35-year-old acting prime minister, who's a perfect product of the provincial risen up from the bottom up to challenge this top-down approach that they've always had. They will face more of those, and more of those willing to enlarge a sense of participation at the local level. Those people will come in rather than others, any of the figures that you're now seeing playing musical chairs in the macro politics of Moscow and variously campaigning occasionally by tours in the United States and other Western things. It's all a kind of surreal game at the top. The real forces of change are these provincial governors presently invisible who only need a couple more years. If we can get through the next couple of years without this kind of a turn, I think the place is going to take off and be an amazing surprise. And again, the question is, will it take off under authoritarian nationalist auspices that will be dangerous to us, or in a more open market and democratic context? Yeltsin himself sought legitimation in this rising new cohort of political leaders when he brought in Boris Nemtsov from Nizhny Novgorod, the leading area of provincial reform, and again chose his junior colleague now to be acting prime minister. Now, when one asks, what can America do? And this is, I'll end up with this, and we might want to throw this out for as a discussion. One should begin by recognizing something positive that America has done. On the whole adequately, and that is convey a general sense of sympathy and regard for the Russian people. And I think the president has been wise in maintaining a consistently friendly relationship with Yeltsin, even despite all his warts and obvious problems. This has minimized the sense of embarrassment and humiliation which they feel, but has not basically satisfied it. But simple human friendship at the top and rhetoric, generalized rhetoric about a partnership for peace are not enough without some major substantive American commitment that will break through the smoldering resentment and assertive nationalism that continues to be on the rise in the Russian political agenda. What is then America, what is it possible to do? Well, first of all, we should recognize it is both a geopolitical necessity and a rational political and economic opportunity for the United States to put Russia on the front rather than the back burner of its policy agenda. It is clearly, in the long run, far more important that there be a friendly government with good prospects for the future than that Russia please us on all immediate policy matters in the short run. Russia is unlikely to go back to a communist regime, but an authoritarian nationalist dictatorship could pose as many problems for us, as I've already said, as the declining communism of the late Soviet era did. Now, it's wrong to assume that not much can be done simply because it would require too much money. Of course, to Russians and to much of the outside world, this argument seems strange at a time of such prosperity in America. a prosperity brought about in no small measure by the end of the Cold War itself. The fact, however, is that government-to-government money is not what is either wanted or really needed and required. 1.5% of the Marshall Plan was spent on bringing young Germans over after World War II to see for themselves how our kind of society works. This proved to be far more important than many of the more expensive activities in the Marshall Plan. It allowed a whole new generation of Germans not just to see for themselves how a free society works, but to adopt our experience to their situation, for them to make the choices, and for them to become the interpreters and advocates within their culture on how to apply the essentials of the American model to their necessarily quite different history and society. The result in Germany has been one of the most successfully functioning and economically successful federated democracies in the world. We have never made anything like a comparable investment in bringing young Russians over to America. Up until the last few years, there were more Chinese coming every year to America than there had been Russians coming in the entire period since World War II. So the first step we could take, which would have a practical impact in jump-starting the learning process on the functioning of an open and accountable society, would be to bring over a genuinely dramatic number of Russians, say 25,000 in one summer, for exposure to the rich variety of institutions and regional experiences that make up our continent-wide democracy, and particularly expose them to the functioning of a civil society, the mediating institutions that Tocqueville said was the real secret of making democracy work on a continental scale, as our founding fathers often feared it might not. We are still at the stages of tokenism in all our exchange programs and our short-term, rather modest economic links. But these small-scale activities have given us a set of models that can be rapidly expanded and developed. Bringing a large number of Russians over both avoids the patronizing syndrome of sending Americans over there to tell them how to lead their lives, and at the same time provides the podvig, this imaginative, heroic deed that would indicate to the Russian people the genuine human interest that I believe the American people really do genuinely have in their experiment. There are all kinds of ways this could be organized, with state governors, sister cities, with major industrial enterprise taking the lead. A young Texas entrepreneur who was then living in Houston, Jeff Sandifer, launched such a program in the summer of 1993. There are many other models to build on. It would not take much expense to craft a program that could have a genuinely dramatic impact on the young generation in Russia, help diffuse their drift and propensity into nationalist isolationism of their own, and there could never have been a more important time to do it now on the eve of parliamentary elections in '99 and a presidential election in the year 2000, which will surely set the stage for which way Russia is going to go. In the economic sphere, there is a great need to generate some dramatic growth in the early capitalist economy so that Russians in their current stage of development do not continue to feel a nostalgia for the imperfectly privatized factories that were little more than non-productive welfare organizations for their employees and for the collective farms that represented in effect a new form of rural slavery. No one would feel the nostalgia that is, believe it or not, increasing these days for such economically unproductive and in many ways humiliating units as the giant factory and the collective farm of the Soviet era, if they had a more dynamic and inspiring vision of capitalist development actually functioning within their own country. As it is, Americans are investing 12 times as much money in China, which is making no pretense at building democracy, than they are in Russia, which is making these efforts to do so. That is totally incomprehensible to the Russians, and I have to say it is pretty hard for me to figure that one out. When you consider the argument that's generally made is that, well, this enormous country, this great market, their actual functioning high consumer market is the size of Italy's, no matter what their population is. And while there is a tremendous importance, geopolitical importance to China, the imbalance of a 12-to-1 ratio is simply hard to understand either on economic grounds or geopolitical grounds. What is needed is massive amounts of capital investment, and there are things we could do more actively to help them develop, of course, contract law, a rational, consistent tax system, and institutions which would guarantee better protection against the kind of corruption, crime, and unpredictable play of arbitrary forces which perplexes and drives away so many potential investors. But the Russian stock market has actually been a profitable investment in recent times in spite of all the difficulties. And I believe the time is right to develop a really major investment strategy, a strategy that could at the same time address the psychological and geopolitical problems I have been emphasizing. So what I would propose would be a major joint American-Russian effort to develop the world's last great economic frontier, Siberia. Siberia is the last great repository of untouched natural resources on the earth, and America has both the capital and the skills to develop it if we are willing to make a long-term investment that would be needed. We at the library, as many of you know, have been digitizing the treasures of America and getting them into American schools and libraries all over the country with amazing effect. We're getting 2.5 million electronic transactions every working day at the Library of Congress, getting the story of America back into the classroom and helping in the audio-visually attuned generation to get them back interested into thinking and ultimately reading, to answer questions raised by Civil War maps, photographs, early Edison movies, political cartoons, the writings of the Founding Fathers in their original hand. We have proposed for the Russians, and they are enthusiastically responding, as I was engaged in discussions with them just 4 days ago in St. Petersburg, that we do a joint digitization project on the opening of the two frontiers of European civilization, the Russian and the American, as a parallel subject, and get these materials digitally transmitted in the schools systems and the library systems of both countries. The two frontiers met, as many of you know, in Russian Alaska and even at Fort Ross, just north of San Francisco, the farthest southern outpost of Russia's eastern frontier, as it had our western frontier at the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, the Monroe Doctrine was partly propagated to keep the Russians out of Oregon, and not just the Spaniards out of creeping up from regions closer to all of you down here. Focusing Russia's attention on the eastern frontier and on their internal development needs would help distract them from their fixation with the shrinking of their national borders, the eastward expansion of NATO. At the same time, it would fortify a country committed to developing democracy against the incursion that they all feel will eventually come from China. So that a country which is having an enormous religious revival and is trying to build a democracy gets something more like the balance of investment that a country that is systematically repressing religion and making no effort to build democracy seems to be getting from the United States. China has irredentist claims in much of southern Siberia. Their maps show. I was lecturing 50th anniversary of the Fulbright program in interior Chinese cities. It's a little over a year ago, and I bought maps for our map division, all of which show Vladivostok, a significant amount of the Amur Basin, as part of China. These are maps being formally printed today. Everyone in Siberia practically believes that it's just a matter of time before Chinese expansion will begin in that direction. And so it might be useful to think about some kind of geopolitical check, but of course I'm not a geopolitician, and the geopoliticians have this total fascination with China. But on the other hand, this is not insulting to China. Doing something constructive with another country is not a negative thing. It's not using embargoes and inappropriate things. It simply is suggesting that some kind of balance could be made. Anyhow, a major national investment in Siberia would undercut also the emotional appeal of the legitimate emotional appeal of the authoritarian nationalists in Russia, that they alone are fighting to preserve the pristine integrity of Russia from predatory invaders and developers. The point here would be to develop an economic plan for Siberia that integrates ecological concerns with developmental ones right from the beginning. And that's happening. There's a joint Russian-American, very young team working in the Baikal Basin that is working on that. We met them when I was with this group with the senators. It was the late Soviet efforts to reverse the flow of rivers of Siberia and change its entire ecology, as well as the policy of dumping atomic waste in various areas of Siberia, that enraged Russian conservatives into wanting themselves to break away from the Soviet Union altogether. If America would appear now not only as a partner in economic development, but as a partner and indeed perhaps even a guide in integrating from the beginning ecological considerations with developmental ones, we would set a new model for ourselves and for the world in general, and it would have amazing imaginative appeal for the Russians, who have an almost mystical feeling for nature and a kind of belief that Siberia has a kind of, is in fact a kind of Russian frontier. Massive plans are already in the files of many American companies, from the spate of assertive speculative planning that major American corporations did in the early 1970s, when it looked like Russians might have been might have opened up a real major investment opportunities. It didn't happen at that time, but they're still there. I see Mike Halbooty, if I'm not mistaken, in the audience, who's one of our real imaginative thinkers along these lines, as well as come up with some marvelous ideas over the years across the Bering Straits. It's an exciting frontier, and probably some initial government guarantees, or at least minimal covering of political risk, would be needed at the outset, but that's, of course, what the Exim Bank was set up for in the first place in the 1930s. A small amount of government-guaranteed loans could prime a very large pump. There may be a model for such development in the giant Sakhalin project for developing that oil region, and there's no reason why other countries could not be involved as well. The combination of economic strain and the psychological sense of cultural humiliation will give us a continued risk for the near future of authoritarian takeover in Russia that could occur through any variety of scenarios. The only thing that will be certain about such an authoritarian takeover is that however it happens, or whether it's authoritarian takeover or simply Yugoslav-type chaos in the region, the one certain result would be heightened resentment against America. We have no excuse for not averting a danger and realizing the opportunity that lies before us with our erstwhile enemy. It would be a glorious thing to close the books on the last great trend, the last great conflict of the second millennium by a gesture which in fact would be good investment for us and a major step in making possible the emergence in the other half of the Northern Hemisphere of a new land that wants to be very much like our own. Together, the G7 nations with Russia, the G8 perhaps, could provide an example as well as a reassurance to the rest of the world that more responsible cooperative models exist for international activity that would have a chance to prevail in the coming millennium, and would prove that America and American democracy functions really not just for itself, but in a dynamic relationship with the rest of the world, something we often talk about, but rarely have concrete plans for developing. We just close with one sort of image, leave one image with you of how the Russians, intelligent Russians, see themselves. President Yeltsin was concerned about the drift in Russia, and he set up a commission to determine what should the new ideology be for Russia. And the man named Satarov, very bright, one of these guys from Saratov, one of the provincial regions, set this thing up. And they published a long thing, but I had a long talk with him just a couple of days ago. And I said, well, where do you think, what's your image of future Russia? He says, well, I tell you, he said, we have a new, my series for PBS is an attempt to relate the current crisis in Russia to how Russians have adopted art forms that they didn't originate in the past, because they're now dealing with the art of trying to build a new kind of society. And I think there's more to be found in the cultural past than in all the political and economic analysis we get all the time. And so I was interested in this question of how the Russians see themselves. He says, and I was interested in what's the new art form that's going to express the aspirations that the Russian people themselves have. And he said, well, the new art form is going to be some form, it's going to come out of television, it's going to come out of audio-visual universe, which is now flooding into Russia. And he said, the best thing we have now is 30-second little stories that are told by animation by a whole new group of young writers. And it's called Skazki o Novorussi, Tales of the New Russia. And these are like, he said, we've used all the techniques of American advertising. We've decided, looking at all the stuff coming in from America, the best thing they do is the ads. The rest of the programs are hopeless, but the ads are brilliant. And so we're doing the ads, but we're trying to, so he showed me one, and it lasted about 30 seconds. And it's a marvelous image. A little kid is trying to build a house with blocks, but his parents are having a fantastic fight. See, this is sort of, and they're having a fight, and the windows are open, and the rain and the snow is blowing in, and they go, and it follows a sort of MTV kind of motion. It's wonderful sort of synthesis of the Super Bowl halftime ads kind of thing. Everybody's rushing in, and they're running. They're having this terrible squabble, and the wind and rain is coming in, and they're having this. They move from room to room, and each room is a little vignette of a kind of different part of contemporary Russia's confusion. But meanwhile, the little kid is building a house, and it's going up and up, and finally they reach the struggle reaches a crescendo. They come back in the room they started in where the kid's building the house. They knock off a little of it, and the kid looks up to them and says, "Why don't you two shut the window?" And they suddenly look at each other. They go over and shut the window, and it's all kind of quiet. And the camera comes back, and you see the house, and the guy's putting the blocks in and moving ahead. It's kind of a nice image, and I think that we could maybe help build a little bit of the house. They've got to be able to stop the screaming at each other, but we're much more involved than we think. Anyhow, I welcome your questions. So let's...
Thank you very much, Dr. Billington. We'll take the question. I just want to state that Dr. Billington's address has been broadcast over the internet. You were talking about communications, and on closed-circuit TV on Rice campus to the students, and it's part of our Shell lecture series. We'll now start taking your questions. The gentleman there, and then the lady there. Gentleman.
Mr. Billington, I wonder if you would comment on the issue of native expansion into Eastern Europe, particularly why this issue, which would seem to have profound implications for U.S.-Russian relations, has generated relatively little debate in American society.
Well, there's several questions there. I think it generates relatively little discussion in American society because of this general seeming retreat from. I'm not sure that the American people aren't interested in foreign policy. They're just not exposed to it very much. You just get no foreign news about. I mean, I was kind of interested before I got here to surf around and get some news about what was happening in Russia. They don't have a government at the moment. It should be a matter of some interest. I couldn't get. I got third-rate psychologists analyzing the grandfather of somebody who was a friend of somebody in the Arkansas disaster. I mean, you cannot find out what's going on in the world from the American media, and I think we have simply got to be aware that our future depends. We're very much involved economically. Anybody can tell you. I mean, we're a global market. We're interacting. Our lives, our jobs, our families are dependent on things, our economy, I mean, everything. But so why is there no debate on this? Because there's not much discussion of foreign policy in general. And that seems to fit into the paranoid view of people who say the Americans aren't interested in anything unless they're opposed to it or something, unless you have an enemy. And that's not a good sign. So that's the first thing. Now, why specifically? I think in general, the only people who are really viscerally interested in it are the people who have strong feelings about and quite justifiable feelings about the way in which Poland and Czechoslovakia and to some extent, lesser extent Hungary, but still Hungary, all those countries have suffered in the past from being left exposed at at Munich and at Yalta and at various other places. And there's a legitimate sense that we owe them something, that we owe them some reassurance and so forth. So I think there's a perfectly understandable reason why there's a strong feeling on behalf of this. And the Secretary of State expressed that very eloquently. The arguments against, the arguments that say, well, wait a minute, there are a lot of other questions too, are not, there's no way of getting them on the agenda. There's no constituency for them. And we have created a situation whereby the dialogue on foreign policy is so determined by highly focused special interests. I don't think that's bad. I'm not criticizing that. I think it's, I share feelings about the, you know, what, no one can survey the history of Poland and Czechoslovakia without having a feeling that the Western liberal democracies owe them something because we've let them down so many times in the past. The whole history of a country like Poland has been one have been left to be carved up by authoritarian neighbors. And one can understand that the instabilities create worry there. Whether the best way to handle it is this way or not is a very serious question that's just not being debated. And I think it's unfortunate. And I think that there's almost no sense anywhere in the foreign policy because of the I think because of some of the biases in the geopolitical industry that I've already indicated, that there's anything positive could come out of Russia. And as I've tried to indicate, there's no guarantee that anything positive will come out of Russia, but whether that, you help make that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you assume that there's going to be a bad outcome there, you help produce the bad outcome that you've assumed. And I don't think people realize the extent to which this plays badly. Now, I don't think it's the end of the world. That's why I think, I mean, if you can't change the policy, at least change the subject. And I think it would be useful to have a positive, if you have something positive going with the Russians, it won't seem as threatening to them as it does in a situation where you're doing really nothing else except of any significance except expanding NATO eastward. There's no way to make it look good. Of course, it creates tremendous problems for the countries that then get professionally left out. We may very well be faced with a situation, say, and there are any number of scenarios. The likelihood that, disaster scenarios, the likelihood that any one of them will occur is not very great. But the likelihood that none of them will occur over the next, or something similar, is also not very great. For instance, supposing you got an agitation in eastern Estonia. That's almost entirely Russian, populated by Russians around Narva. That's ethnic Russians. It's an ethnic Russian compound within Estonia, just to take for an example. Supposing there was unrest and the Russians just decided to come in and rescue their people, and they said, well, and then we said, well, let's have a plebiscite. Plebiscite would probably be in favor of that small group going back to Russia. But the fact, it makes it marginally more acceptable to do that if you've expanded NATO eastward, because you have then you've more or less signaled that that's the limit of how far you're going to go and where your interests stop. And it might be more effective as a deterrent to the Russians not to be saying we're going this far, and then they say, well, we're not man unless we go do something similar. And that's the kind of thing the kind of conditions that we ought to be thinking about, and we ought to be. But it's very hard to have a public debate about all this, because even suggesting something like that seems to be sort of legitimizing it for the Russians, which I don't think it would be legitimate. I think it would be a terribly illegitimate thing to do. The problem is that the Western world would be much less effective in dealing with it under these conditions, whereby we're seeming to go back to a spheres of influence rather than a collaborative and partnership relationship. Also, there are a lot of cost considerations. There are a whole lot of other things. I mean, to what extent do you want to make the kind of irrevocable commitment that you're going to go to war over what? And what are the financial implications? I mean, there are just a lot of questions that need to be answered. And, but my brief answer is that I think there are a lot of unfortunate consequences of this that have not been considered. I do not think it's an apocalyptical thing, but it becomes much more serious if we don't have something positive going with the Russians that's serious and not just verbal. You can't do serious things with one party and then verbal things with the other and claim that you're equally interested in both. So I think it only heightens the importance of doing this, but the difficulty of doing this is that there's this general indifference to foreign policy anyhow. And that's why I'm inclined to think that the kind of the private sector has got to be, both in terms of bringing people over, in human terms, and in terms of investment, has got to be involved. But it requires some government help, and there has to be some political leadership that's willing to step up behind this. And it's very difficult where they perceive, the politicians perceive, that foreign policy is not a matter of interest. They don't, and particularly an issue that's complex and many-sided like this, that doesn't have, it's the small group that has a specific high visceral interest that tends to prevail over the broad general considerations that our system, if it were more deliberative, but it's become increasingly plebiscitary, the functioning of our democracy, and as a result, you can't really deliberate these things very effectively, either with the media or with our political system. It's a very, you point to a very serious problem, and I'm sorry that I just make it more serious by my verbosity. I'll try to be more brief.
The lady there.
I hope the answer to my question is positive. Do you have a chance to talk to our Secretary of State about your in-depth views and understanding the matter of
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, she was a fellow at the Wilson Center, which when Secretary Baker was on the board and I was director of it, and yes, I've talked to her. But she's a very and she's very knowledgeable about this part of the world. Of course, she has deep background in it. Yes, I mean, I have a continuing dialogue with a number of people, but I'm just one voice among many, I'm sure. And it's not for me to say whether, I mean, I think these issues are the bigger problem when you raise the Secretary of State. The bigger problem is that this whole complex of things in Eastern Europe is only part of a global agenda, which she and I think the president's now in Africa, and as you know, and he's so you have a situation where our interest and our attention span is getting more and more global, while our resources for foreign policy, even including the funding of the State Department, are shrinking more and more, so that everything, we tend to feel a vague sense of anguish about everything and are unable to do much of anything. I'm not sure that's a very persuasive posture for leadership. But it's not a question of this Secretary of State or that Secretary of State. You have a very intelligent, well, she came here. I know she came. She was made her first public appearance here and was very, very pleased to be doing that. But at that level, you have a sort of, you have a compensation for doing nothing by kind of vague anguish about everything, empathizing with everybody's problems and everybody's history. And then you fail to do what geopolitics should do to some extent, and that is assign priorities to what's really important and what isn't. And I would contend that in human terms, I mean, in God's eyes, everything is equally important. All points on earth are equidistant from eternity, as the great historian Ranke once said. But in terms of what, if you can't do everything, how do you prioritize what you're going to do? And this is, we just aren't very good at prioritizing anymore. An external enemy focused attention very nicely on priorities. Whether they were good or not, they at least, that enforced a discipline. We don't seem to, and we don't seem to have a sense of the opportunities. The really big thing here is not the danger so much as the opportunities. I think the dangers are very great, as I've indicated, but the opportunities here economically, seems to me, are amazing. And people, everybody's looking around for things to invest in. And here's the biggest untapped source of natural resources and of human resources. I mean, as I say, these people are, this is a very educated population. Their educational system is running down. Their whole scientific establishment is disintegrating. But all of that means for those human as well as natural resources that make it a great opportunity. And I just don't think we've got the, we don't have the mechanism, and she doesn't have the mechanism. It's not her fault. It's just not there at the moment to prioritize and focus better. And I think maybe the Baker Institute can do that. Yeah.
We'll make her focus, Dr. Hyman.
Jim, I have two brief questions. You suggested a very exciting idea of bringing many Russian individuals to this country as part of a mutual education program. There are many thousands of recent Russians, of course, emigres resident in the United States. Has there been any opportunity to study how they report America and the reaction of their reports in Russia?
Good question. I don't know that there has been. I don't think there has been. Most of the ones that are immigrating, I mean, there are two categories. There are either just people who want to get away and leave, and the other category are people who are engaged in largely kind of trading relationships, and that's short term. They're not really developing the economy. They're making money. They're not really making products or making services. And that's not very healthy. So that what you need is to get what we did with Germany was you could identify now the emerging political and administrative elite of that country, and we have a lot of repeat people that keep coming all the time, but there are whole regions of Russia that have never sent anybody. Most members of the Duma have never been in this country or any Western country, for instance.
That leads to the second.
And that needs to be, yes, second part. No, you should.
Well,
Somebody should.
Billington chairs a committee in which I have the honor to serve, and I would never interrupt him there, and I wouldn't interrupt him now. But it does lead to the second query. A good many American lawyers, including some in the Houston area, have had trouble functioning in Russia in recent years, opened offices, closed them, and so on. Is the Russian law ready for the kind of investment opportunities, contract, for example, that you suggest?
Could I add just
Yeah.
because I know I'm not in the oil business obviously, but I know a few people who have tried for many years since 1991 very hard and spent lots and lots of money in Russia to make deals there, but have had enormous problems because the tax law changed, the currency laws changes, what you can take out changes. You can't find the person who is actually responsible to sign something, and if you do, it's the wrong person, and so forth. I mean, it actually is very difficult to do big style investments in the Soviet Union, in Russia, because of the kind of problem that Harold was talking about, the uncertainty of the legal situation and so on.
Yeah, I think this is a big problem, and there are a whole set of problems. People tell me, I know that some of the prominent legal folk, including people, they've made several visits to the Supreme Court recently, for instance, to some of the Russians. And the feeling of people I talk to who know something about this is that things are getting better, that it's better than the perception, but they still have a long way to go. The contract law apparently is not bad; it's just not very well enforced. Copyright law, which is of course equally bad, but copyright law is excellent. I mean, well, we had our copyright. That's part of the Library of Congress, and I don't think we have been aggressive enough in trying to help them in this area. I mean, I think we really, again, if you bring them over, let them adopt things, but I think we really need the legal profession could help a lot in this, and maybe the law schools. Some have, and there are various things have been done, but I think we could. But there's no question it's a major problem. But I think the fundamental problem is political, not the legal system. The legal system, particularly tax law, I think that seems to change. That's not as advanced as I understand it as contract law. And of course the functioning of the courts, of an independent judiciary that needs to be strengthened. All of these institutions that developed only over a very long period of time and kind of are having to develop simultaneously. But I think the fundamental problem is political, and I think that the way things are working now is if you strike a deal with the provincial governors who are getting more and more powers devolving, simply because the tax collection isn't very good. Maybe this guy will be able to, the new prime minister, more and more powers devolving from the center to the periphery. So there are a lot of problems, but I think it's getting better, and I think we could accelerate the process of it's getting better if we made more effort to improve it than to complain about it. Everybody has the same complaints, but there doesn't seem to be any cumulative process of our contributing to an improvement of it. In other words, so everybody, and we would save ourselves a lot of money if we didn't have to go and repeat have the same problems over again. But there's no question this is a big problem, and the fundamental responsibility is theirs to clean it up. But I think we could be much more targeted and much more specific. And I think that the professions ought to take some interest in this. The law profession at some level, or some professional association, ought to make a concerted effort to get them over this hump.
To help with it?
Jim, welcome to Houston.
Thank you, sir.
When I realized that you're going to be here, my wife and I definitely had to see you and hear your wonderful, excellent speech. I'm not going to ask a question because of time, but I want to make an observation. In China, we have a communistic government and a capitalistic society. In Russia, you have a bureaucracy or bureaucratic form of government, and you have the majority of the people still communistic. So both of those situations in China and in Russia is going to have to resolve themselves. I don't think that communism and a capitalistic society can live together. One of them has got to go. So we don't know which one. But when Yeltsin fired all of his cabinet and left himself solely as the leader of Russia, he set himself up as an immediate dictator. It is concern of a lot of people whether or not that will set off a relationship with the government, with the people, to say, we don't want that kind of government anymore. We want to go back to communism.
I don't think they'll go back to communism, but they might very well devolve into a kind of communist-type authoritarian structure. It would have a nationalist ideology rather than a communist ideology, but it would be the same centralized, essentially, system. That's a real possibility. But that's certainly not the first direction he's picked. But Kirienko, the young guy that he picked, is one of the most advanced market reformers in Russia. So if he's serious, and if he stick around, if he's made the permanent fellow, if Nemtsov is kept in the cabinet, I think they mean, at least what they say, that they're going to continue in the reformist direction. Your characterization of the two societies is very good, except that there's one other element, and that is that they have China has a capitalistic society, but they're cutting organs out of live prisoners. That's pretty far gone even for the 20th century. And they are systematically repressing religion, which is one of the strong backbones of a society that has not only freedom but responsibility that's generated from within rather than imposed from without. And they're making, so I'm not sure that, I agree with you. I don't think these things can coexist indefinitely. But it's a good way of putting it, and I think we have a stake in both outcomes. And I guess my only point is I'm not really knocking being involved in China. I think it's geopolitically, that's really going to be one of the great challenges of the 21st century. But I just do think we're just not enough of a player in the Russian scene. I guess that's my main point. Yes?
Well, we're going to have,
yeah.
1 second, we have a gentleman here who's been asking. Lady, right. The spotlight's
As
on you.
one voice among many, I think that yours must be one of the most interesting I've heard. And you have managed to contain in this very compact address more information than I've received over many addresses over a long period of time, and I'm very grateful for your effort. You did make the point, and also you seem with this analogy to the love affair we could have with Russia to possess some of the soul of the Russian poet. So you're doing more than just acting as an American historian and writer, I think. But you mentioned that the next 2 years are critical, especially in this balance between the red and the brown, the authoritarian nationalist dictatorship versus the more democratic, capitalistic. The next 2 years are indeed critical because, as I understand it from the cardiovascular dialogue, the dialogues I have with cardiovascular people, Russia is not going to make it to the year 2000 with its present leadership. So we heard Ledbed the other day, and he told us that he was fatigued with social violence. You mentioned that as a truism of most Russians. And yet he seems to me to represent authoritarian national dictatorship. Now, in the next 2 years, when the crisis evolves, as it probably will, what is going to, if you have a provincial prime minister and provincial governors aiming for the top spot, what is going to keep the authoritarian national dictator from rushing in and obliterating the chances you've suggested here today? It sounds to me as if it's an emergency as far as your ideas are concerned.
Yeah.
Well, you made a comment that we'll try to get your reaction to.
Well, yeah, I think it is. I think it's a peculiar kind of. It's not exactly an emergency, but by the time we realize it's an emergency, it'll be too late to do anything about it. You see what I mean? I mean, when Mussolini made his march, they realized that the chaos in Italy that ended World War I really was an emergency. Up to then, everybody thought Giolitti and Nitti were kind of amusing characters, and there was little speculation, who's doing what to whom, and so on. And all of a sudden, somebody made a march on Rome, and that was it. And Hitler came to power entirely legally. It's worth remembering. It was not an armed revolution, and nobody took Hitler very seriously until he suddenly emerged. He never got a majority vote or even a significant. But so I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which this could sneak up on us. Yeltsin used the phrase early, what he called the creeping coup. Ползучий переворот. Now, creeping in Russia is the way cockroaches come out at night. They creep up. You think you got the food all covered and so forth, and suddenly they're just cockroaches. You got in the morning and it's just crawling with cockroaches. This ползучий, they just come up. And this is what can happen in a system where there are all these ex-communist officials and these demobilized soldiers. Remember, they had, at the time of the coup attempt, they had 5.5 million people under arms. That's the largest uniformed armed services in the history of the world. And they were faced with 150 armed people. Faced them down, and the whole system collapsed. Why? Because there was a moral transformation going on in the society, totally uncovered. I mean, I was there at the time. I was there those 3 nights around the thing, and I witnessed this and saw it and felt. I wrote a little book about it, which was more or less totally neglected with reviews because it didn't have any sensational revelations. But the fact of the matter is, it was a thing called Russia Transformed. But and I've analyzed it since. I mean, and the heroes of that thing were old women. They were unlikely people that aren't in the history books. It was the old women in church that sociologists always made fun of because they went out for For 24 hours, the people in the tanks didn't have any orders. They were ordered in there because the assumption was on the part of the Putsch people that faced with this sort of armed might, they'll collapse. I mean, look, you just roll in the tanks and everybody runs away. Well, most people did. There were just very few people there, and there were only 150 people with arms, so it was, but nobody wanted to give the order to shoot. And in those hours, the old women went out, and suddenly there was a new chain of command. It was the mothers talking to disobedient 19-year-old kids in the tanks. And, and that was happening all over. Yazov, the Minister of Defense, his wife came in and said, "You're not going to shoot these kids," are right in the middle of the meeting in the Russian version of the Pentagon. Can you imagine? I mean, this was a pretty magnificent case of a country exerting moral force against military force. So they have done something pretty big. And the question is, are they going to be defeated by something really quite small, which would be a kind of Lebed type or somebody like that? Lebed may clean up his act. There are lots more. There are all kinds of people, ex-colonels and Afghan veterans and people posing in front of uniforms, rehearsing their speech and figuring how they're going to do it. And somebody just might succeed, like a Pinochet and succeeded in Chile for a while. It would probably only be an interlude, but it would be a disastrous time for America, and it could be very destabilizing for world geopolitics. So it's not an emergency, and yet it is an emergency. And how do you dramatize something like that?
Because how would we recover from that?
Yeah, well, we can't dig out from the Yugoslav crisis, and that's about a 15th of what this would be if you've got conflict with Ukraine or Kazakhstan or with, I mean, there are all kinds of scenarios. That's a very volatile, very unstable situation. And so we do have a stake in it, and I appreciate so many of you putting up with the visiting firemen.
We want to thank you. You can tell that there are so many more questions, Dr. Billington, but we'd like to present you with this gift from the Baker Institute, and thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.